The world laughed when Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, stood before Parliament and declared that his desert nation would plant 200,000 hectares of cocoa. The international press erupted in mockery. "Chocolate in the desert," sneered one Parisian newspaper. A German analyst joked it was like planting coffee on the North Pole. Aid officials muttered warnings of bankruptcy, while think tanks in Washington predicted collapse within 5 years. Across Europe, cartoons showed cocoa pods shriveling in sand. The laughter was loud, but beneath it was fear that a small, landlocked country might rewrite the rules of dependence. For generations, Burkina citizens had been told what they could not do. They could not resist the desert. They could not feed themselves without foreign aid. They could not compete in global markets dominated by giants. Traoré shattered that script with one audacious move. He was not simply planting trees. He was planting sovereignty, staking his nation's future on a crop long reserved for tropical forests, a crop that symbolized luxury, power, and global demand. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was starkly different from the ridicule abroad. Old farmers shook their heads in disbelief. If millet often failed, how could cocoa survive? Yet young voices rose in defiance. A student in Ouagadougou told state television, "If our president believes we can do it, then why should we doubt? For once, our fight is not about leaving for Europe. It is about staying here to build something new." The stage was set. On one side, mockery and forecasts of disaster. On the other, hope that a forgotten nation could chart its own destiny. Traoré framed cocoa not as an agricultural gamble, but as a war for dignity. Every seedling a soldier, every hectare a battlefield against poverty. But the question echoing across the Sahel remained, was this vision a miracle in the making, or a mirage doomed to vanish in the desert sun? If you were in Traoré's seat, would you choose freedom or safety? Stay with us, because this story may change how you see Africa's future. And before we continue, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next chapter of Burkina Faso's bold gamble. From ridicule to revolution, can cocoa take root in the desert? The declaration had barely left Captain Ibrahim Traoré's lips when the echo began to circle the globe. 200,000 hectares of cocoa, announced not in Ghana, not in Côte d'Ivoire, not in Nigeria's lush forests, but in the dry, windswept Sahel of Burkina Faso. The world shook its head. European newspapers splashed sarcastic headlines across their front pages. One German analyst on primetime television sneered, "It is like planting coffee at the North Pole." A Washington think tank warned the project would collapse within 5 years, bankrupting the fragile treasury. Aid officials muttered that the country would soon come crawling back for emergency food shipments. The laughter was loud and merciless. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the story took a different turn. For decades, citizens had been told only what they could not do. They could not resist the desert's advance. They could not feed themselves without imports. They could not compete in global markets. Now their president had flipped the narrative. Traoré's message was simple but electrifying. If cocoa, the crop of kings, the luxury the world craved, could grow in Sahelian soil, then no one could dictate limits to his people again. In dusty villages, old farmers shook their heads. "Cocoa belongs to the jungle. Our land is too dry, too hard," one muttered. But among the youth, the reaction was different. Students filled with restless ambition saw in Traoré's words a chance to anchor their future at home rather than chase dreams across the Mediterranean. A young man in Ouagadougou declared on national television, If our president believes, then we must believe. Otherwise, who will? For the first time in years, the language of migration gave way to the language of staying, building, and fighting for something new. Within weeks, the country began to move. Military barracks, schools, and community centers were converted into nurseries. Soldiers once seen only with rifles now carried watering cans, marching in rows beside fragile seedlings. Television cameras captured the surreal sight, a cocoa army clad in fatigues and sandals, children and soldiers side by side, carrying buckets of water to keep the green shoots alive. Teachers wrote rhymes about cocoa as freedom. Women's cooperatives organized planting brigades and began whispering about processing beans into chocolate of their own. Traoré himself gave the movement its heartbeat. Speaking to citizens, he reframed the gamble in stark, martial terms. Each tree is a soldier in our war for sovereignty. 200,000 hectares means millions of soldiers standing against poverty. His words resonated deeply. Planting was no longer just farming, it was patriotic duty. Families who had never even seen a cocoa pod before now dreamed aloud of bars stamped "Made in Faso." International media scoffed louder. Cartoons showed cocoa pods wilting into dust. A British official warned that Burkina Faso risked draining its meager treasury. The IMF released gloomy projections of fiscal disaster, but on the ground, something irreversible had already begun. To mockers abroad, the seedlings were folly. To Burkina citizens, they were proof of defiance, visible green against the brown dust of resignation. The effort quickly turned into a national ritual. At dawn, women carried buckets to nurseries. At dusk, youth patrolled fields to guard fragile shoots from goats and wandering cattle. Village elders prayed over seedlings, invoking protection for the strange new crop. The rhythm of life shifted around the act of nurturing cocoa. It was no longer just about survival, it was about dignity. Still, the dangers were real. The Sahel's climate was unforgiving. Rains fell late and ended early. Dust storms could strip tender leaves in days. Aid experts shook their heads, predicting mass death of seedlings and a humiliating retreat. Even at home, whispers spread. If the project failed, would Burkina Faso become a global laughingstock? Traoré anticipated the doubts. He leaned into the narrative of risk. Sovereignty, he told his citizens, is not the absence of risk. It is the right to face risk on our own terms. The words struck deep. For a people long used to outsiders dictating their destiny, the very act of choosing their own gamble, success or failure, felt like liberation. The paradox was stark. Abroad, Burkina Faso's cocoa project was a punchline. At home, it was fast becoming a movement of unity, identity, and defiance. Every seedling carried two questions with it. Could cocoa really take root in the Sahel? And, if it failed, what would become of the nation that had dared to dream so loudly? The breaking point, collapse or awakening. By the third year, the grand vision hung by a thread. Across the Sahel, thousands of cocoa seedlings withered under the merciless sun. Photographs began to circulate in European newspapers showing fields of shriveled stalks and cracked earth. Headlines screamed, "Traoré's chocolate mirage collapses." The ridicule was relentless. Aid agencies published reports predicting bankruptcy within 5 years. IMF analysts warned irrigation costs were spiraling out of control. To the outside world, it was proof that Burkina Faso had gambled its fragile economy on a fantasy. On the ground, despair was palpable. In some villages, goats breached fences and devoured entire rows of seedlings. In others, broken pumps left fields dry for weeks. turning young leaves brittle. Farmers returned to bare soil and shook their heads. Perhaps the foreigners were right. One man muttered, "Cocoa cannot live here." Social media across Africa lit up with memes, cartoons of chocolate bars melting in desert sand, jokes about sand-flavored cocoa. Even regional leaders, once silent, began to whisper. Had Traoré crossed the line from bold to reckless? The pressure reached its peak when international cameras flocked to devastated nurseries. Western journalists lined up to capture the image of failure. It was then that Traoré staged a moment that would become legendary, surrounded by citizens and cameras. He bent down, pulled up a dead cocoa seedling, and raised it high. His voice rang steady. "This one has fallen, but millions more will rise. Sovereignty is not born in comfort. It is born in struggle." The scene was broadcast across state television for weeks. What foreign audiences saw as confirmation of failure, Burkina citizens interpreted as a rallying cry. The image of their president holding a dead tree became a paradox. Weakness transformed into defiance. Instead of retreating, people doubled down. Farmers replanted. Youth brigades carried water through the night. Women's cooperatives organized protection patrols. In villages, elders invoked the moment in prayer, calling fallen seedlings martyrs for sovereignty. But not everyone was convinced. The losses were enormous, and the desert remained vast. International lenders sharpened their warnings. If the project continued, Burkina Faso risked financial ruin. Western economists framed it as hubris, proof that poor nations should not attempt what nature forbade. And yet, something in the national psyche had shifted. Failure no longer looked like surrender, it looked like sacrifice. The region watched uneasily. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, the twin cocoa giants, dismissed the plan as delusion in public, but quietly dispatched delegations to study Burkina Faso's techniques. In Mali and Niger, agricultural officials debated whether agroforestry might also provide hope against creeping desertification. For the first time in decades, the Sahel was not discussed only as a zone of famine, but as a laboratory of defiance. Globally, reactions split. Western media doubled down on ridicule, but environmental groups began to voice curiosity. Ecologists pointed out that even struggling cocoa groves slowed erosion, trapped dust, and created shaded microclimates. "What looks reckless," one remarked, may actually be Africa's most ambitious agroforestry experiment. Inside Burkina Faso, the psychological battle was as important as the agricultural one. For ordinary citizens, the struggle over seedlings became a struggle for dignity. They had been mocked for generations, told their land was worthless. Now, even in failure, they saw themselves fighting back. A teacher in Bobo Dioulasso told his students, "These trees may die, but each one teaches us to stand taller. We are no longer victims of the desert. We are challengers of it." The paradox deepened. Every dead tree became fuel for defiance. Every setback was reinterpreted as sacrifice. The project had shifted from farming to faith, from agriculture to identity. And as the fourth planting season approached, a question loomed not only over Burkina Faso, but over the world watching. Was this the beginning of a collapse, or the birth of something that could awaken the entire Sahel? When cocoa became a nation's identity. By the fourth planting season, the cocoa experiment was no longer just an agricultural project. It had become a mirror in which Burkina citizens saw themselves differently. What began as seedlings in dusty nurseries had transformed into a movement that shaped politics, society, and even the nation's sense of destiny. The first effect was psychological. For generations, Burkina families had been told their soil was barren, their economy doomed to dependence. Now, even in the face of hardship, they witnessed tangible proof of defiance, rows of green standing against the brown dust of resignation. Parents told children stories not of migration, but of planting. "These trees will build your schools." One teacher in Bobo Dioulasso said, "They will feed your children. They will keep you here." This shift was profound. Migration, once a survival strategy, was slowly replaced by rootedness, pride, and a sense of belonging. Women's cooperatives rose as one of the most visible social forces. Across villages, women organized planting teams, managed water distribution, and later began training in processing techniques. A mother in a cooperative declared, "We no longer just cook food, we prepare prosperity." Cocoa became a gendered revolution. Women who had long been confined to subsistence farming now stood at the front lines of economic innovation. Their cooperatives pooled resources to build drying stations, purchase small grinders, and prepare for the day when Burkina Faso would not only grow cocoa, but also produce chocolate. Politically, cocoa redefined leadership. Traoré had not only positioned himself as commander-in-chief of the army, but also as commander-in-chief of the seedlings. Each speech about cocoa was also a speech about sovereignty, about the right to choose risk, rather than accept dependency. His words resonated beyond his borders, fueling debates in Mali, Niger, and Chad about whether they too could transform despair into abundance. Within Burkina Faso, cocoa became a litmus test of loyalty. Supporting the project was equated with patriotism. Critics at home risked being labeled as traitors, not just skeptics. Yet the project also produced divisions. Older farmers, especially in the north, worried that the focus on cocoa diverted attention from millet and sorghum, the staples of survival. They whispered that hunger might follow if rains failed. Some opposition politicians accused Traoré of gambling the nation's food security on a dream crop. The government countered by showcasing intercropping systems, beans and maize thriving under the shade of cocoa, proof that food security and cash crops could coexist. The debate did not vanish, but the symbolism of cocoa overshadowed it. Internationally, the consequences rippled. European corporations that had long dominated the cocoa-to-chocolate pipeline began to worry. If Burkina Faso managed to not only grow, but also process cocoa, the profits that had flowed to European factories for decades would shrink. Lobbyists in Brussels quietly pushed for new tariffs under the guise of food safety. Western analysts warned that Burkina Faso was distorting markets. But for citizens at home, these threats only reinforced the sense that they were challenging a global order built on keeping Africa poor. The civil-political impact extended further into governance. Cocoa revenues, though modest in the early years, began funding wells, schools, and solar grids. Villages that once relied on charity to pay teachers now paid them with cooperative profits. For the first time, citizens felt that their taxes and labor were building their own nation, not lining the pockets of foreign corporations. Sovereignty was no longer abstract. It was visible in new classrooms, paved roads, and clinics. Even the military's image transformed. Soldiers, once symbols of coups and instability, were now seen watering seedlings, guarding nurseries, and transporting equipment. State television rebranded them as the Cocoa Army. This fusion of military discipline with agricultural mission softened the image of the armed forces and bound them closer to civilians. In a country where distrust of the military had been deep, cocoa forged an unlikely bridge. But with transformation came tension. Could this identity built on cocoa survive global market shocks? Could the patriotic fervor endure years of waiting before full harvests? Critics warn that a crash in cocoa prices could unravel the dream overnight. Others feared that making cocoa synonymous with sovereignty risked turning agriculture into ideology, where questioning the crop became questioning the nation itself. Still, the momentum was undeniable. Cocoa had ceased to be just a crop. It was a new national identity, a rallying cry that united farmers, women, youth, and soldiers under one symbol. It had reshaped politics, society, and the very definition of what it meant to be Burkinab. The world might still laugh, but inside Burkina Faso, the people were no longer laughing at themselves. And so, a question emerged not only in Ouagadougou, but in capitals across Africa. Could cocoa turn Burkina Faso from a forgotten desert state into a pioneer of sovereignty? Or would this bold identity prove too fragile to withstand the storms of economics and nature? The world reacts. Threat or inspiration? As cocoa fields in Burkina Faso pushed back against the desert, the world could no longer look away. What had begun as a punchline was now a story reshaping global debates about trade, sovereignty, and the balance of power in Africa. In Washington, think tanks that once dismissed the project as delusion began to recalibrate their tone. Reports circulated through policy circles, warning that if Burkina Faso succeeded in both cultivating and processing cocoa, the nation could set a precedent for Africa. One analyst wrote bluntly, "If this model spreads, the entire logic of aid dependence collapses." For the United States, the gamble posed both risk and opportunity. On one hand, it could destabilize the global cocoa industry and challenge UN-aligned corporations. On the other, it offered a chance to back an African-led model of self-reliance that might reduce the influence of rivals like China. Behind closed doors, debates simmered. Should America cheer the experiment or quietly work to contain it? In Europe, the reaction was sharper, even defensive. Chocolate corporations headquartered in Brussels, Zurich, and London saw danger in Burkina Faso's cocoa belt. For decades, African nations had exported raw beans while European factories captured the profits. Now, for the first time, an African country was building its own processing plants, producing chocolate stamped made in Faso. Lobbyists pressed the European Union to impose new regulations disguised as food safety standards. Newspapers sympathetic to corporate interests warned of market instability and African overreach. Yet the louder the warnings, the more obvious it became that fear, not logic, was driving the reaction. Across Africa, the story inspired curiosity, even quiet admiration. Mali and Niger sent delegations to study Burkina Faso's irrigation systems. Chad discussed pilot projects to replicate agroforestry techniques. In Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, the reaction was complicated. Publicly, officials dismissed Traoré's project as fantasy. Privately, however, agricultural analysts admitted concern. If Burkina Faso succeeded in producing and processing cocoa, it could weaken their near duopoly on global supply. Citizens in Accra and Abidjan began asking uncomfortable questions. If Burkina Faso could build chocolate factories, why couldn't they? The environmental community added another dimension. Ecologists from Brazil to Kenya hailed the project as one of the boldest agroforestry experiments of the century. They pointed out that even partial success, green corridors cutting through Sahel dust, slowed desertification, restored biodiversity, and created microclimates where food crops could thrive. What the West called reckless, Environmentalists reframed as innovation in climate adaptation. For ordinary Americans and Europeans, the story carried symbolic weight. Headlines shifted from mockery to